Welcome to Conversations With, a podcast series exploring the people and practices shaping the impact of private philanthropy to benefit communities across Africa. Conversations With is produced by the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, working to promote robust, effective, and responsive philanthropy and to build a network of informed, engaged, and connected funders. Visit the africagrantmakers.org website for program notes and to join our mailing list.
I'm Niamani Mutima, Executive Director of the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group. Thank you for joining us for Conversations With. And our guests today are Alcinda Honwana and Nyeleti Honwana, co-authors of the recent article, Youth and COVID-19 Prevention in Africa. Welcome, Alcinda and Nyeleti.
Thanks so much, Niamani. Happy to be here.
Thank you, Niamani.
Great. So this is a very timely conversation for funders working in Africa, and we're really pleased to have this conversation with both of you. What I'd like to do is to ask each of you to share a bit about your background that contributed to your perspective on this issue, and then we'll move on to talk about the article. Alcinda, can I ask you to start off?
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Niamani. Well, my background is I am an anthropologist, and I've been working on issues of anthropology and development. I have a particular interest on issues pertaining to young people. I started my career by looking at how populations negotiated in southern Mozambique the transition from war to peace. And in analyzing that process, I came across the situation of child soldiers and young girls being abused during conflicts and wars. And so I did quite a bit of research on that, and I wrote a book and published many articles on that. And from following the situation of children affected by conflict and their reintegration into society, I came across young people who were not involved in conflict but had the same difficulties into getting engaged in society. And that led me to look at youth transitions into adulthood, youth employment opportunities, youth engagement in politics and participation. And then I developed my work into youth politics and youth social movements, etc. So issues regarding young people and then their citizenship, their contributions to society, their own kind of fulfillment as members of a community, members of society, but also their contributions to society is something that is very much part of my work. But also as an anthropologist, my work is very much at what is happening in society, in how those things are articulated. And I think it's very important not just to look at youth in isolation from intergenerational relations, but also on how they fit, how they are supported, how they contribute, and how in terms of the relationships between the state and youth, you create a kind of a social contract that can be operational, etc. So that's what guided me into looking at youth in the context of COVID-19.
Nyeleti, how about you?
Well, I've been Alcinda's daughter all my life, so I'll start by saying that. So our dinner discussions and growing up, this is, talking about youth and talking about her work has always been a part of my life, has been my dad's work. But more recently, I've been in philanthropy working with young African scholars for the past 5 years and learning about the academy and learning about how it is that young people, especially from kind of the world's periphery, are understood, are viewed, right, in terms of their contributions. That's really shaped the way that I've started to think about overall how the continent and its contributions to the world, to world history, and to now contemporary issues is also viewed and understood. And so to that end, I actually co-founded an organization last year called Global Black Youth, which really works to support and amplify the efforts that are coming from young Black people, young people of African descent around the world, right? And so it's really with those two lenses, both the philanthropic work and now with this organization that I started thinking with my mother as we were locked together in confinement during COVID about what it is that's happening on the African continent and how youth particularly are really leading so much of the innovation that we're seeing and translating those innovations that have come before COVID to really help answer some of the issues that COVID has brought to the fore. And so I think giving that close proximity and those conversations that we wouldn't automatically have really allowed us to start thinking about this issue more deeply.
The mother-daughter collaboration brings a particular intergenerational insight into this paper, which is why we're also really happy to be discussing it. So with that, let's talk about your article, Youth and COVID-19 in Africa. What prompted both of you to collaborate on this topic? Nyeleti, let's start with you.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I actually remember the day. I don't know if my mom will remember it this way. She was giving a number of interviews right during lockdown. And one particular was the BBC interview that she was giving. And we were just talking kind of about what she was going to touch upon. And we got into this really interesting debate about, framing and the different interventions that are going on the continent. I was also organizing a series of conversations around specifically technological innovations going on the continent. And so as we're kind of debating and discussing and deciding what's going to go into the interview and what isn't, my mom was like, there's something, we have something to say here and we need to write it down. And I don't think that I, necessarily took it to heart. And a couple of days later, she had kind of started something, sent it to me and said, okay, this is our paper, let's go. And that's kind of how we approached it.
And Alcinda, aside from remembering the fateful day when you all started the discussion, what prompted you to want to collaborate with Nyeleti on this article?
For me, it started earlier because I've been having these discussions with Nyeleti on other issues and seeing the way she thinks about things. And I said, have you written this? You should start putting those things into paper. And so when we have on that day that I was giving this BBC interview, she has interesting ideas and all new information that is coming up through her networks, through the things that she's reading, through the people she's meeting. And even I must say in my own research, I have learned so much just discussing it with my daughters and knowing how their peers think and understand things, not just at the way that I will engage young people, but also about their conversations, the way they see the world, the way they interpret things. So I really wanted Nyeleti to kind of start putting her thoughts on paper. And in the end, it was a beautiful collaboration. If it was just my paper alone, it wouldn't be as good as having this kind of intergenerational conversation and bringing both our ideas together. So I'm very proud of the product that we two have put together.
Alcinda, let's start with you. What's the conversation that you're hoping this will stimulate?
Yeah, in fact, I must say, Niamani, we had written something a little longer than the paper that was published, because there were 2 points that we wanted to drive into the conversation. One was, how is it feasible and what would be the best ways to address the pandemic within the continent, in the African context? That was one of the points we were discussing. In terms of, societies are different. They operate in different ways. They have a particular system of meanings, of values, etc., that influence the way people act, people behave, people socialize, etc. And just this kind of drive, on the one hand, to just collate and paste, or cut and paste strategies that were happening in the most developed countries in the West, or in the global North, like lockdowns and confinements and tracing and etc., was not enough given our particular conditions. And so there were limitations to that model. On the other hand, was the idea that these initiatives would be taken mainly from an epidemiological perspective, not taking into account cultural issues, issues of sociability, how people relate to each other, what kinds of solidarity networks, but also the emotional toll of something like the COVID pandemic. And the balance between those two was really important. So that was one aspect of the things that we had been debating. And not just Nyeleti and me, but Nyeleti's sister and my husband, because we were all in confinement together. So those would be kind of dinner time, breakfast, kind of things that from time to time we would discuss. The second point was that, this pandemic was touching upon the elderly mainly, or at least at the time, that was the main belief. And so I said, but looking at youth, how can this be a moment of empowering youth? And we started that discussion, and slowly, both Nyeleti and I started receiving information and reading things in which young people were already doing things. And so we set to do this research and looking at what is happening. What is it, organized, unorganized, voluntary? We started bringing that together. And so it was two things. First, the more broader things about what things you privilege, but also how this group, which is the majority of the population, will have space or create space for itself to engage in this process.
So Nyeleti, what is the conversation that you hope this paper will spark?
I think we've been discussing this, and we discussed it through the writing process, is thinking about who our audience was. And I think it was very clear from my perspective that I was writing for the young people themselves. I mean, obviously, as you go through the article, it's clear that we're making some recommendations that are useful, right, for authority figures, for government, for other stakeholders during this COVID pandemic. But my perspective was really to try and showcase what it was that young people themselves were doing and what they were thinking. I think what was so interesting during this time, especially the early months of kind of global shutdown, is young people themselves were writing. Bloggers from Nigeria to South Africa to Morocco were writing about the incongruity of the way that lockdown measures and social distancing measures had been imposed on a number of African communities and countries. And so it was really about bringing to the fore the thoughts that they had themselves and making sure that their definitions and understandings of what was going on in their community really came to bear in the paper.
So you give examples from different regions. Your examples really span the continent, from DRC to Burkina Faso to Mozambique, Cote d'Ivoire, and Kenya. What do these examples tell us about the narrative about young people across Africa that's really prevalent?
Well, I'll start. I mean, I think one of the things that we definitely wanted to do with the paper is begin to shift the narrative about what was possible and what was happening on the continent. And I think what so many of our examples touch upon is that these young people are working in a myriad of sectors, right? And they're working in digital spaces, they're working in the health sector, they're being entrepreneurial, they're partnering with private sector. There are all of these various interventions that are being done and are being started in various context, right, depending on the feasibility. And it was important to us to show that diversity of the type of intervention, because I think that the dominant narratives, and this is really the work that underpins both my work at Guggenheim and also at Global Black Youth, but it's these dominant narratives that about young African descendants and young Africans specifically that are so detrimental, right, as being apathetic, as being negatively disruptive, as not being creative. And what these examples actually show is the opposite, is that they're actually innovative, they're creative, they're entrepreneurial, and they're leaders. And so what we advocate for in the paper, and what we hope that kind of translates to the various readership that we might get, is that these are people that already deserve investment, right? These are ideas and these are initiatives that very much can be scaled, right? That can be with the right partnership, with the right space. These are initiatives that we should be thinking about, not just as they relate to COVID, but beyond COVID, right? People who are looking at the economic impact and long-term economic impact of COVID, sociocultural and political. So, but really just to hammer the point that these young people are really showing a different kind of story and telling a different story about themselves and about their communities. And that needs to become part of the narrative and the way that we talk about young people on the continent.
Alcinda, what do you feel that these examples tell us about the narrative that people have about young people across the continent?
Well, I would start by saying that when we looked at the examples, we wanted to first, through these examples, to try and learn and understand what was it that was moving young people and in what areas they were privileging their focus. And so that was very instructive for us because we already believed that young people would be able to do these things. So there was a narrative there, but we wanted to understand more specifically in what areas and what kind were the changes across regions within the continent. That's why we tried to spread our research as much as possible. And so what we came across were two areas we could kind of group them. One was in terms of prevention and mitigating contaminations of the disease, of the pandemic, by using not just the digital world, but also community engagement with people passing on messages. The younger generation is much better educated in Africa today than the generation of their parents. So they have a role to play in terms of passing on messages. And as we know, in the digital era, misinformation is also available out there. So how do people know what to do, how to do it? And we see a large number of young people using their digital skills. And this is Nyeleti's area. She will expand on this to really contribute to their communities. And then the second space that we saw were interventions more on the social and cultural aspect, the kind of solidarity across generations, solidarity across within and across families and households, solidarities within communities. And when we looked at that, we decided also to look back at how did it happen with previous pandemics in the continent. And that's something that is not in the current paper because of space. But we did look at Ebola situations. How did it happen in terms of community engagement? We looked at what was in there. And also even for the HIV/AIDS pandemic in the continent. So there were some lessons learned from there, and also understanding the importance of this digital era and the way young people were so heavily connected to social media and social networks and the power that they have in that. We do talk about the influencers, the musicians, the cultural icons, etc., within the youth community and how they influence others. We do talk about the new sites that they create independently from the more broader sites, and they create specifically to engage into discussion, but also to create information. And in terms of cultural issues, there is also the issue of language, which is central here. How do you pass on the information? And we see young people time and time again being focused on translation. And then translation is not just language translation, but the cultural. How do we put this in a way that my grandma, my granddad can understand, my community can understand? That's why those interventions driven by young people deeply involved and connected within their communities are so important.
One of the points that you all make in the paper is making sure that any interventions that are made are adapted to the local context. Can you talk a little bit about what does that mean? What are the questions that people need to be asking themselves and thinking about to have an understanding of what you mean when you say that?
Yeah, what I mean is that, people, there is always a philosophy of life. There is a way of being in different communities and different places. So rather than kind of jumping in with preconceived models and ideas, it's important to have a solid understanding of the cultural universe and the social universe of the groups and the people we are interacting with or we intend to act and interact with. And one good aspect is that if those interventions are done in connection with local partners, they facilitate the way we tailor and adapt those interventions to context. Let me just give an example. In some African countries, not all of them, there have been very strict lockdown measures. But those lockdown measures did not work as well as the state or the governments intended. Because first, there are serious issues about space. How, and we see that in many African contexts, people living in slums and living in precarious neighborhoods, and the issue of space is a concern. And also the fact that the street is part of the space of the community. The kids play in the street, they go home to sleep, and maybe 8 of them sleep in a little room. The household has 2 rooms, 1 room for the parents and all the kids in 1 room. So when the street ceases to be the space of the community and they have to be locked into their little space, what does that mean? And when the street is the place where you make your livelihood, you sell, the mother puts a little table outside the door and sells some vegetables, but she can no longer do that. Or the son would go out and sell products in the street and can no longer do that. So we have seen that there have been some tensions and revolts, and we do talk about one or other case in our paper in which they go against and they say, you're asking us to lock down, but we don't have any safety nets. We don't have any social security measures. What we have to go out and fend for the day. So those are issues that have to be looked into context. There's no stimulus package in most of those societies, of those communities. So, but we understand that from the epidemiological point of view, it is important to restrict people's movement. But so why not, for example, instead of putting the onus on the individual, we would take African concepts like Ubuntu or Ujamaa to understand community at large, this notion that I am because we are, and strategize our lockdown processes around extended families, extended households, in which several people, you kind of lock people around their community, the group that they select to confine with. And within that group, they create their solidarity network, their distribution of tasks. Who goes out to try and sell products in the market? Not everybody goes. Maybe grandma doesn't go because she's more vulnerable. The young people go. Why don't you, creating those strategies, but around the cultural universe that makes sense, the kind of point that we would like to drive when thinking about those issues. Sometimes it is challenging and not everything has a solution, but it's important to try and understand and put ourselves in the context of those particular populations that are going through those vulnerabilities and difficulties.
I also want to ask you about the perception that people have about the use of social media among young people in Africa.
I think the perception is rapidly changing, right? There have been a number of watershed legislation that have been continent-wide helmed by the African Union around freedom of speech and access around digital spaces. And I think that as we talk about the use of digital spaces, the use of communications like WhatsApp, social media, and others on the continent, that conversation is growing and it's percolating as it is anywhere else. Obviously, there are country region specific differences. For example, in Rwanda, you have a country that has 70% access to internet, right? Which means that so many people, not just young people, are completely comfortable using digital apps and mechanisms for payment and a number of other things. And as we think about COVID specifically, and one of the major issues that we've been trying to answer on the continent is the spread of misinformation. And I think that social media and these digital apps becomes a great example for how misinformation, disinformation, and no information is really being countered on in digital spaces and over social media, and predominantly by young people who are the main arbiters, right, of those spaces. And so a number of the examples that we give in the paper are really structured around how region-specific apps in the languages that pertain to that context are coming about, how young people are often contradicting some of the information that's coming from the state, from the government, from health and other officials. And what's been really interesting, I think, is investing in that space and investing in access, whether it's through telephone only data, right, as so many people can only really access, social media, Facebook, WhatsApp platforms because they don't have access to internet. But as we know, more and more, that's how the majority of the world is now getting their news, right? It's through social media. And so thinking about if we're interested, right, in having an intervention in that space, how we can start to use social media and how we can really start to scale the social media initiatives that are happening and the digital platforms that are percolating around COVID.
As you cite in your paper, that 70% of Africa's population is below 30, and the average age is 20. So what suggestions do either of you have for funders about how they should be thinking about and/or incorporating this important role of young people in not only COVID-19 prevention, but also in their overall grant-making strategies?
Yes, actually, I think that was definitely something that was on my mind as I was writing about this. And I think, and these are conversations that we've had at AGAG for years now. And so I think this is really the perfect place to be discussing this particular question. But we at AGAG, and I say we as I also sit on the steering committee, we've been thinking about how it is that we can break out of some of our silos. I think that as private funders or other kinds of funders, we have particular interests, we have particular issue areas or geographic regions that we would like to see, whether it's socio-political, economic, or cultural change. And so our work and our programming is so often designed around that. And what some of the examples within this paper show is that while young people are the leaders, we explain, of these interventions, they're really working in such a diversity of sectors that I think there are a number of different entry points for people who are interested in working either with young people, with the communities that they're serving, or around issues of COVID, right? Because while these interventions have been made COVID specific, they have started in many cases before COVID, and they'll continue and have long-lasting impacts that go beyond this pandemic. And so it's thinking about a long-term investment or a long-term intervention plan that highlights some of the digital innovations, some of the health innovations, and the thinking that spurred these innovations forward. I think if we start to reorient the way that we think about young people and how they engage with other stakeholders, right, with mothers, for example, with women specifically, right, who are the young women who are leading some of these initiatives. A lot of them have been working, for example, in the health sector and paying specific attention to young women and the effect of COVID on their lives, whether it's around school and other issues. And so as I say, there are a number of these different entry points through which philanthropic professionals and other funders and donors can really enter into that might continue to pay respect to the specific issue area that they have, but also broaden and allow for some of the intersectionality that obviously exists during a situation like a pandemic.
I would like to build upon what Nyeleti has just said. And the fact that we have mentioned that youth are the majority of the population, what it means is that they are everywhere. They are in every sector, they are in every aspect of the society. And no matter where your particular focus or particular interest is in terms of supporting those groups or communities, the interventions will touch upon youth. But I think what is important is what kind of engagement, or what kind of perspective that contribution or that intervention is privileging. Often there is this idea that young people are not engaged, they are a lost generation, they are disenfranchised, but also they are apathetic to what's going on. They just want rap and music and easy life, etc. But if one takes the perspective that young people are also committed, they understand what's going on around them. And all these interventions need to have a strong intergenerational focus, because this is the majority of the population, but it's also the population that is making the continent lively today, because young people are bubbly, they are the ones that usually experiment with things, and in the digital era, they are the ones that are in the forefront of that, but they are also the generation of the future, the leaders. And so if philanthropic organizations have in mind that young people are an important group within that society, and those interventions also have to account for what they have to offer in terms of their vision, in terms of their ideals, in terms of their aspirations, because those are the things that will shape the future of these communities. So whether you're intervening in health, whether you're intervening in education, whether you're intervening on social movements, whether you're intervening on the environment, young people are in there. But what are they thinking? How do what they think relates to the existing government strategies? And it's not a surprise to anyone that there has been some kind of intergenerational tensions in which, young people feel that they are misunderstood, and the older generation think that young people are not serious enough, and also with governments, with the state institutions that are there to serve the population. Often they have beautifully written policies, but the practice and the implementation of those policies is not at par with the needs and the aspirations, because often these young people are not consulted. So if those interventions are aware of that and start involving more a conversation that is cross-generational, cross-sectoral, and also we don't want to present here young people as this romantic idea of youth. Youth is very heterogeneous. They have, they think differently, they have different aspirations, they have different ways of being in society. Of course, there will be those who are apathetic. There are those who might be involved in violent situations. There are those that will not engage, but there are those who are doing a lot of other things. And so it's looking at that diversity and looking at, for example, not forgetting that when we talk about youth, women are also very important because their voices are often left out. But that conversation across generations and across sectors, different areas of society, I think it's very important.
What's your perspective on making a differentiation between those who have access to cell phones and access to technology and those who don't? Nyeleti?
Thanks for that question, actually. In the paper, we don't differentiate specifically between an educated or an uneducated intervention, but what we do have are some examples, and a specific one would be of the Niamani Institute based out of Kivu in the DRC, in which you have a young person who's leading this essentially civil society organization, but who works with predominantly volunteers from the community. And this is a community that has been a long time ravaged by war and conflict. And so they've lived this for several decades. And so his work started out in kind of allowing the community to work through some of the trauma of that conflict through theater. When COVID hits, he uses the same volunteers, many of which are current or former insurgents or soldiers, to start spreading information about how best to counter COVID, right? And so the majority of the people who he's working with are illiterate. These are people who just live in the community and want to make sure that they're keeping their families and their community members safe. And so in that way, I think what's been great is to see a kind of melding of, at least in this example, of educated and perhaps less educated people. But the other thing that's talked about quite a bit within our Global Black Youth Network is to the extent to which the information and the conversation that happens online in digital spaces so quickly jumps off the screen and becomes the conversation that's happening offline. And so, young people who might be discussing something within a digital space or via WhatsApp or another social media application will be discussing those same things with grandma and auntie and other family members who are not in those spaces, right? But the spread of information kind of back and forth is much more fluid than we might otherwise think. And so again, in terms, and this goes back to some of our other points and other questions that you've raised today, Niamani, is also, to what do we prioritize, right? To what extent do we, again, silo one kind of intervention versus another, when in fact, digital spaces and offline spaces have a much more fluid kind of relationship than we might otherwise expect. And again, that's to say that young people are not in a vacuum. They're interacting not only in digital spaces, but also with their wider communities. And so in the paper, as I say, we don't make that distinction, but because we found that there is very much this fluidity between both spaces. How do we, highlight the work that they're doing? How do we connect them to resources, but allow them to be the drivers of the interventions, of the change that we see? And I think what's been most interesting and potentially most promising on the African continent is the kinds of entrepreneurs that we see emerging and the kinds of entrepreneurship interventions that are going on. And so many of them, so many business-minded young people, especially women, are focusing on social issues, right? It's entrepreneurship to benefit their communities. And the ways in which we've begun to craft some of our programming at Global Black Youth has been to connect people to different types of mentorship, to connect people to resources both within their countries and contexts and also beyond, right, international donors and supporters and such. But the last thing really has been to also take stock and take advantage of the current moment, right? A moment in which we're discussing issues of race, a moment in which we're discussing issues of diversity, and that's a conversation that's happening in the US, but it's also happening globally. And so as other stakeholders begin to find and understand the importance of having African descendant and Black voices at the table of the various decisions that they're making, it allows us an opportunity to kind of push that conversation forward and present these young people as knowledge producers, right? These are people who understand a context, who understand what the implications of interventions are, and they're working from that base of knowledge. And so presenting them as the experts of their context and the experts of the kinds of investments and interventions that would make the most sense where they are, I think has been the key really in making sure that their initiatives and their interventions don't become co-opted by other potential stakeholders. And then lastly, and this is something that my mom and I have discussed, is also kind of broadening the tent, right? Inviting other stakeholders to be a part of that vision, and specifically locally, that includes local leaderships, community leaders, private and public sector, right? And allowing this to kind of take hold. And we have a couple of examples in the paper in which we see that, right? We see in Cameroon, for example, one of the interventions that's happening has been happening with the support of the local health ministry. And that's really that's helped them really scale the work that they're doing and have the impact that they would like to have.
I want to ask both of you if you have any food for thought or closing comments that you'd like to leave with us before we end. Alcinda, do you want to start out?
Yes, I will. Thank you, Niamani. I think a point that I would like to make is that our paper focused very much on the role that young people can have and have been having in this process, in mitigating the effects of the pandemic, in supporting communities, etc. But I also wanted to say that young people have been heavily impacted themselves by the pandemic. not only in terms of losing employment, jobs, and livelihoods. And as we know, the majority of the younger population in Africa is struggling with what I call in my writings waithood, this kind of waiting period, twilight zone in which they are not able to become independent citizens and have to manage their lives outside formal institutions. So the informal economy, the kind of side arrangements that young people have to engage in to make ends meet and carry on with their lives. So that, which was already a problem, has been magnified with the COVID-19 pandemic. So in terms of income generation, in terms of them being able to be independent and continue to sustain themselves, the pandemic has been a serious problem. But it has also been a serious problem for students, for young people involved in secondary education, tertiary education, even primary education, if we look at children, is that some of the schools, in some countries, schools have been closed. The schools don't have the conditions to do the social distancing, and e-learning, it cannot be widespread, and it's not a reality in the continent. So this has also impacted this generation in terms of their training, of their education, of their acquisition of knowledge. And so the several organizations and institutions have been thinking about this in terms of development, in terms of responding to the aspirations of this generation. And there is some worry that we will have a lockdown generation in the future, because this will scar, what's happening today will scar young people for years to come. So I think it's also important, especially when talking to institutions like yours that provide programs and funding for support, also taking into account that this is a group that has been heavily impacted. But also just some parting thoughts in terms of citizenship, and is that citizenship is exercised in many ways. There is the kind of everyday life citizenship engagement that young people have in their communities, with their families, etc. And, just a young man or a young woman who is caring for the children in the community, or has a particular function in the church or in the mosque, and that person is a role model, is respected by the elderly, but also respected by their peers. And so is this kind of everyday life citizenship engagement that is also transforming society. You don't have to be in a digital network. You don't have to be part of a big association or have funding to create something, but there is this kind of everyday life engagement that is happening also in the communities. And thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Alcinda. Nyeleti, parting thoughts.
Yeah, I think my parting thought, for this conversation and for this group specifically would be to kind of end on narratives. And it's also the ending point of our paper. I think narratives are powerful, right? And the dominant narratives shape so much of the way that we think about anything that we do. And I think in terms of philanthropy, the narrative that happens at the various levels of any kind of an organization are central to the kind of intervention or programming that happens at the end of the thinking that we do in our institutions or amongst ourselves or our board. And I think what's happening is the continent has been saying for decades now that this dominant narrative, the pervasive narrative of Africa and of the countries within the continent has been changing. And potentially the way that we've been responding to that change has not happened at the rate of what we see on the ground. And I think that COVID has really exploded that, and it allows us this moment of introspection where we're all at home, we're all rethinking how we work, how we organize ourselves, how we fund. So it gives us a moment to also think about how we understand the places that we're interested in, right? Most of us, all of us here are interested in on the African continent and issues that pertain to African communities. And this moment forces us to reevaluate the way that we understand those same communities, those same people, especially in light of what they've been doing and what they've been, I guess, producing during this time. And so for me, I think one of the takeaways and one of the kind of continuations of a conversation that I would like to see is how we reckon this moment with action, how this really affects the way that we start to think about, understand, and then act on what we're seeing on the continent that maybe we hadn't had our eyes open to previously because we hadn't been forced to because of this current moment.
Alcinda and Nyeleti, thank you both very much for joining us today. This has been a great conversation, and we appreciate you taking the time to talk with us. The intergenerational aspect of it has also been particularly important. So Nyeleti, thank you so much. And Alcinda, thank you.
Thank you so much for having us.
Thanks for listening to this episode of Conversations With. We hope you enjoyed it. Please visit our website at africagrantmakers.org and join our mailing list. Until our next Conversations With, be well.